to them, so we don't have to worry so much.
Okay. Do you think I can get quick the printout of my presentation in case something goes wrong?
Yeah, you have enough
Yeah.
time for that.
Okay, good.
The Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium presents Transforming Guyana. In each episode, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis will tackle a different area of interest for transforming Guyana.
Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of the Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium webinar series, Transforming Guyana. I am Terrence Blackman, Chair and Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York and founder of the Guyana Business Journal. Dr. Anthony Bryan of the University of the West Indies and the Caribbean Policy Consortium is my co-host today. Our regular co-host, Dr. David Lewis of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and Manchester Trade and Cooperation, is traveling. So we wish him safe travels today. I just want to say that this has been a really highly subscribed program. I think we have 125 folks who have registered for this one from all across the world, Switzerland, Belgium, the United States, Guyana, and I trust that we will have an insightful and informative conversation today. As is usually the case, it's always important to say, what the GBJ stands for. We aim to, provide innovative and practical recommendations that advance the goal of a secure, open, safe, prosperous, and cohesive Guyana in which all Guyanese, irrespective of race, class, ethnicity, or religious persuasion, share equitably in the economic prosperity of Guyana. And to this end, this series, Transforming Guyana, brings together experts, prominent voices from Guyana, the Caribbean, the diaspora, and around the world to discuss the impacts of Guyana's oil and gas development. We aim to offer a nuanced look at the opportunities and potential pitfalls ahead for Guyana and to explore strategies to maximize the positive impacts of the oil revenues on Guyana's people and future while mitigating the risks that have been faced by other countries. And I think important to identify the promising roles that the diaspora can play in this transition. Today we've gathered together a really stellar panel. We're joined by Tony Paul, Energy and Policy Strategy Advisor. Tony's work supports equity and sustainable development for oil and gas mining. Joel Bagwindin, the Director of Spherix Professional Services and the Commissioner for the Public Procurement Commission in Guyana. Andre Brandley, a Professor of Molecular Pathophysiology on the Faculty of Medicine at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, Germany. And Thomas Rodriguez, Local Content Director, Executive Vice President for the Association for the Mozambican Local Content Regime. So we've really kind of gathered a stellar panel for us to have this conversation. And before we begin, let me take this moment to invite my co-host, Dr. Anthony Bryan, to bring a few words of welcome from the Caribbean Policy Consortium. Anthony?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Terrence, and greetings to everyone that's watching this program from around the world. I am in Trinidad at the University of the West Indies, which this country is my home. But I am a founding member of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. It was founded in late 2020 to focus on Caribbean policy work, supported by a network of policy and academic institutions in the Caribbean and North America. So we take a very focused approach on Caribbean policy interests. And one of the important things for us is to forge strategic partnerships with the objective of widening the initiatives geared towards the Caribbean. In this context, we are very pleased to join with the Guyana Business Journal and collaboration on transforming Guyana. I want to welcome all of the panelists. I know most of them, and I think we are in for a very, very lively discussion on the question of local content policy. All of the oil-producing countries have had to go through this. Trinidad and Tobago, I think Tony Paul would remember very well, the trials and tribulations that we had. And certainly Guyana has faced that. So Terence, I look forward to a very lively discussion.
So really, thank you, Anthony, and we'll jump right into it. I'm very pleased to have with us today Anthony Paul, internationally recognized energy and strategy advisor on in-country value creation and retention and good governance in the oil and natural gas area. Anthony is coming to us from Oklahoma this morning. He has over 40 years of industry experience with technical and commercial roles in operations, management, and leadership across the value chain. So Anthony, the floor is, well, I said I would say Anthony for Anthony Bryan and Tony for Tony Paul. So Tony Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Terence, I'm not sure whether you can see my screen or not. I'm trying to share it.
No, we can't see it just yet.
Oh.
Maybe you want to try to upload, when you click on that button that says present, you should be able to, it should guide you to uploading the file.
So let me upload it, but it's telling me I can't do animation, so hopefully I'll be able to get through this fine.
Okay.
So it's uploading as we speak, I think. Yeah. In any case, let me start with the context while this is uploading. So thanks again, Terence and Anthony, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure. Nice to see some friends, Jarrell, Thomas. Nice to see you guys. Hope you're doing well. I am, by way of background, Terence did some of it before. My presentation on my work in local content came out of working and learning from other people in other places. So I started this thing a long time ago. So my work really started before this was a subject that was written about. So I'm not at all an academic. I'm a practitioner. And the background comes from work I've done. And I started this thing a long time ago. So my work really started before this was a subject.
Did we lose him? Seems like we lost. Seems like we lost Anthony Bryan. Seems like we lost Tony Paul. I
don't know why.
Okay, here you are. I lost you for a brief moment.
So I'm back.
Yes.
So it's telling me share my screen. It's asking me to share a PowerPoint.
Okay, so if it's a PowerPoint, perhaps you should just say share PowerPoint.
I did. I'm not sure. It's not. Let me see. Letting me pick it. I'm going to send it. I love the screen. Send it up. Okay, gotcha. Sorry about that. I lock the screen. A lock button below. Oh there. Select Google Chrome. Look at that here. Okay, let's see. I think I'm getting there.
No, it's okay. Take your time.
Yeah. Record the content of game. Okay. Quit and reopen. So it's telling me quit and reopen. Okay, so let's see if I can do that. So it's letting me share it, I think. Let me see if I can do it here now. It's asking me to restart Chrome, so I may have to come back in.
Okay, or maybe if
apologize
you
for that.
can,
Yeah.
just email it to me, and I can see whether or not I can put it
Sure,
up.
sure. Let me restart Chrome, and then
Yeah, you'll go away for a sec. Yeah. So while we wait on that, I what I'm hoping is that Tony will give us some kind of sense of a definition and scope of local content in the oil and gas industry, so as to ground our discussion, and then to kind of, you know, give us some sense of some key elements of a robust local content framework, and then really kind of maybe pivot to, you know, questions around collaboration between government, industry, and other stakeholders for effective local content development. We'll give him say another 2 minutes or so. So he's back. Did you send to me?
I have not, so I was just starting to restart. Let me see if I can do this here.
If you can, perhaps it can be. I might be able to help you there. Yeah,
let's do that. Let me send it to you now.
Yeah.
Let me send it to you now.
Okay.
Sorry about this, guys.
That's sometimes these things happen. You can't always predict.
I had actually thought about logging in early and finding out, but I missed that.
Let me try to see if I can get it on my end. And okay. See if I can get it here. And here we are. Okay.
Stay here.
So I think I'm almost there. Yeah, so I know that you were, and one of the reasons is that here we go. So there you, and you just tell me, and I'll move the slides for you. That's it, right?
Oh, you got it there?
Yeah, it's on the screen.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So let me get back to the screen then. Oh, there. Thanks so much.
See it? Yeah, you got it.
No, this is the last presentation. This is not my presentation.
This is not the one that you. This is not the one that you just sent me.
It's. Let me just make sure I sent it. It's gone out.
Okay, so I'll go back. So that's the one that I just received. So let me try once again.
Okay, let me make sure I give the right one here.
So that one is Andrea's presentation.
Okay, so it's I've just sent you that email, so hopefully it will be there.
Okay.
Sorry about this, guys. This is not good form. Have you got it, Terrence? It's gone.
No, I don't see it just yet. Okay.
Where is it gone? Okay, so it's in my.
Okay, I got it now.
Okay,
I got it.
Great. Thank you much.
Okay. Got it
Thank
now.
you. So I will work with your.
Yeah. So let me also get that one up, and let me get that one up. So I think this one is Andre.
Yeah. Okay, so as I was saying, this will come from the work I've done in TNT in terms of looking at Trinidad and Tobago's approach to local content, and how we as a nation, even before independence, when we had internal self-governance, recognized that the oil and gas industry had a lot of value. And we established an intent about, one, getting as much out of the ground as we can and getting as much value as we could from the resource, getting as much to stay in country and building people to hear that, to participate in that. And also making sure that the industry supported national development. And we started that process in 1955. And in the 60s, right after independence, in fact, we put together a commission to look into the industry to see how we can do this. And out of that then came a policy for the oil and gas industry and its development, and legislation and regulations to support that. So by 1969, we had strong legislation to do what is today called local capacity development and local content. The term wasn't being used, but the definition was there in law, and the regulation gives specific activities that needed to be done to address that. So I entered, this is 1971, so I entered the industry in 1978 with those firmly in place, and we could see that Trinidad and Tobago developed a really robust supply chain. Thanks, Terence. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
A really robust supply chain. So these are the questions I was asked to address, which we all know. I'll skip them for now. Next slide, please, Terence. And Trinidad and Tobago was doing this while I entered the industry. I was lucky to be part of it in the government and to be able to further that and do some things around that. So as an example, in putting in place local production sharing agreements, one term we put was that a company cannot recover more than 10% of its internal spend if it's done out of country. In other words, it's encouraging companies to do things in country. Why? Because we had managed to build a supply chain because everything was done in country in the old days before transportation and telecommunications allowed for things to be done remotely. Right? So that 10% then caused a company who made a discovery to move the entire geosciences team, 38 geologists, geophysicists, technologists, into TNT, which is a big thing because then that cost drove them to reducing the cost by hiring locals. There were no locals available, so they invested in this department in the university to build skills that were specific to their needs. So very quickly, we had a very skilled workforce and a very good university program to develop that. When we went beyond that into moving from exploration into development, the company then moved the whole development team and the procurement team into country, the engineering, fabrication, construction management. So that was a big change. So the legislation and the implementation of it had a big impact in getting local content. And that's the kinds of things I used. And then I had a good fortune to work with the multinational company and to help them do that same thing or to align with that internally. So I learned how companies work, what they can do, what they cannot do, how people in companies manage to avoid things, how they see the risks, how to mitigate those risks. And then I got the chance, luckily, to do that internationally. First, with this multinational in Azerbaijan, building the first modern enterprise development center to build skills in companies, and then helping several countries with strategies for local content, managed to write policy for 4 countries, including my own, and advise other countries and train countries on writing their own, and helping implement. I mentioned before we came on here that I met Thomas and spent a couple of years in Mozambique. That wasn't the purpose of my being in Mozambique. It wasn't specifically local content. It's about governance generally, which really is the core of getting local content right, by the way. And I did get involved in local content there. So managed to have this experience. And that I put out there to say, this is why I'm going to present what I'm presenting today. So if you could, Terence, next slide, please. So the question is, why is local content so important? Next slide, Terence. So this is what, and unfortunately, the slides and the transition has gone. So this is BP's numbers from their own sustainability reports. And what it shows is that a company like BP in 2021, each year represents the reporting year, the year of the report, but it represents the year before. 2021 generated about $250 billion in revenue. 25% came from the upstream, 73% from the downstream. And those numbers are similar across the various years. What's interesting to note in those two numbers is that when countries export raw materials, whether it's oil or natural gas, LNG, they actually export about 3/4 of the value. So they keep none of that value. Now, if you hit the next button, Terence, oops, sorry, go back. a picture is missing, that's fine. But what the picture is meant to see is that over the last 12 years, I show 4 in graphic form here, then I compiled 12 years in a graphic that's missing on the top right-hand side. Over the 12-year period, 2011 to 2022, BP revenue went into providing goods and services was about 82%. Royalty, company value for, I don't know why GBJ is there. Dividends to shareholders was what, 5%. Government share was 2.8%. So even though we have this headline of government tax being 50% plus, we all know tax only comes from profits. Profits only come out after all these costs are recovered, including the company's own operating cost. That 80+% is third-party spend, not their own spend. So the idea of local content, if countries can get even 5% of that 80%, that will be 4% of the total. And that will more than double what countries currently get out of taxes. And that's a number that's out there, but nobody seems to recognize that. Like countries actually get a very little bit of relative value. Now, in our economies that are quite small, the absolute value of 3% is huge. And that's what drowns out the reality of the numbers on the opportunity. So next slide, please, Terence. And so that's the why. So next slide, what do countries want to do? Next slide, please. So countries want to get value from oil and gas. And typically we speak about getting value through jobs, through contracts. And when we think about it, though we don't, it's about actually getting finance to work in the local economy through financing, investment in equipment, technology, facilities, and so on. In addition, countries want to build capacity to participate, but you can also do that to go beyond oil and gas. And I'll come back to that in a bit. But to get local content, you also need supporting infrastructure, institutions like training institutions, schools, universities, technical schools, and other industries that to bring in their services, whether it's accounting, HR. And so for instance, Guyana is looking at building a port. Now, that port is necessary for the industry to grow and provide services. But once that port is in place, we know the multiplier effect, don't we? And that's the kinds of things that local content can target. Some countries also try to get some specific targets in some goods and services. And those are the objectives they go after. Next slide, please, Terence. But typically, local content is not an end to itself. Depending, and I'll show you kind of how Trenda and Tobago thought about it and how I've been talking about it, how you can get local content to be a means to an end. And that end could be increasing national wealth. It could be enhancing competitiveness of firms and of the country, supporting national development, and of course, depending on the scale and duration of activities, enabling and supporting economic transformation. And I haven't got time to go into some of those, but I'll just put it out there and show up something about that. Next one, please, Terence. So my advice on people looking to local content definitions is your definition must suit your needs. Because the definition is very important in guiding people's thinking and behavior. So my suggestion is understand your objectives and define around the objectives. You know, there's some common terms that we need to come to grips with, so that typically what gets done is what gets measured. And my advice is to measure the inputs. Now, local content, in my view, only happens when somebody gets a job or a contract. And each of those is measurable in terms of the monetary value. Now, you can add to that, of course, the investment in training, capacity building, and infrastructure. And that could be part of the definition and the metrics you make. But in terms of the inputs to the supply chain, those are the backward linkages that you want to look at. Now, in some cases, people expand the local content definition to include not only the direct inputs, but what goes into creating the capacity for those inputs. One thing I always advise people is CSR is not local content. Capacity building to support the industry, if it's covered in the CSR brand, then that is local content. But CSR is about the company investing to protect its brand, its license to operate. Yeah. Now it's important to do that because oftentimes the way spend is recoverable is differentiated by spend that goes directly into the operations and spend that isn't directly in the operations. Now, some countries like companies to do CSR don't mind if they recover those costs, but that's fine. Another key definition is what constitutes local. And it's quite easy for an island like Trinidad that is quite small. However, when operations happen around a community, those people in the community are always asking for some part of the action. So there are times when subnational or local community input has to be factored in, and there are ways to do that. In other cases, you run up against treaties that create regional economic groupings, like the ECOWAS community, like CARICOM, like all over the world. And there's that question of what constitutes local, and that's something that has to be engaged with. Now, there are two issues that come up, and I think gets conflated when I hear conversation around Guyana. It's what is local content and what's a local company. A local company, easier to define in that it may be a company that is more than 50% beneficially locally owned. Local content, if you define it the way I choose to define it and the way the Trinidad and Tobago government has defined it in our Procurement Act, is local content is the amount of every dollar spent that stays in the local economy. So it's a very easy measure. Everything we buy or procure is measurable in a dollar value. It's important to do that because other measures can be misleading. So an example I gave is when I was in Ghana, the policy then said that 90% of all the inputs will be local in 10 years' time. And I asked the minister, what does that mean? He said, well, 90% of jobs and so on. So I said, fine. So if I had a rig and had 100 people and 90 were Ghanaians, does that mean the target was met? And he said, yes. So if I showed you the payroll and those 90% only got 10% of the salaries, are you satisfied? He said, no. I said, why not? He said, because it means you're only doing low-level jobs. Right? So I said, therefore, if you want to get better jobs and higher paid jobs, the only measure is in the dollar value. So that's my approach to defining local content. And I define it that way because that is very measurable. And if you measure something, it's the only way you can improve it or figure out how well you're doing. Next slide, please, Terence. So here's where we're looking at goods and services. So I've taken the oil and gas sector. I've looked at the bulk of goods and services. I've divided them by cost, and that pie chart really speaks to the upstream spend and where the money goes. And you can see some of these services are specific to the upstream sector, and they go through the full upstream spectrum. Some of them actually transcend the upstream sector and go into midstream and downstream. But more importantly, those can be used in any other sector, whether it's construction of buildings, infrastructure, engineering for factories, whether it's operating plants, all of these things are usable. So the reason I put that there is that we think that we consider building capacity as a cost. And therefore, people put it out there that it's a disadvantage to business. What I remind people is that actually every single penny spent is cost recoverable. You know what that means? It means that your oil and your gas is sold and the revenue goes into that 80%. That 80% is your oil and your gas. So you're paying for it. So you have to consider, is this a cost that will bring me no benefit? Or is it an investment that will bring me benefit? And my suggestion is that consider this as an investment and consider the benefit you can get. Because if these skills are built by the industry because they need it, the industry is doing it because they can afford it. You can afford it, but not from current revenue, from future revenue. Yeah. But once you can afford it, then you can get the benefit of it, or you should get the benefit from it. So my nephew is here, Anthony, I'm on the telephone. Yeah. So she's Anthony as well. So what I'm making is that as the owner of the resource that's paying for it, countries should understand that they have a right to ask for some benefit from the money they're spending. Okay? And that is, and so that what it does, it says, where can you get the most benefit? The good thing about doing this now is that if you participate with the oil and gas sector, with the major companies and their contractors, you're working with the best in class companies in the world. You're working alongside them. You're learning from them. You're looking at learning the business processes, getting from their experience. So that participation in the sector is critically important to building capacity. Next slide, please, Terrence. Anthony, I'm on the phone. You have to close it, son. Yeah. So how is this done? Next slide, please. So what I've suggested is that there are different horizons for capacity development and different stages. Unfortunately, the animation doesn't work, and this doesn't work so well without the animation. So the two horizons is creating jobs, creating world-class companies, and then if you can, using that to create a sustainable economy that is self-reliant. How does that work? We know, and we target capacity building and participation through the operations, what's happening on the ground in country. But before things happen on the ground in country, a lot of work is done outside of country in assessing the resources, in building a business case, in raising capital, in procuring goods and services, in contracting, in designing project management, in implementation of that project management plan, in understanding the risk, putting in place risk mitigation plans. All these things happen at head office. All we tend to do on the ground is manage labor and manage processes somebody has designed and brought to us. What this opportunity does, no. Hold a second, I have a little one here to sit in here. Oops. Hold a second. I think you have to go outside. So don't worry, my son, whose son this is, works at home a lot, so he warned me of this. Yeah. So in any case, the point here is that we can build capacity to participate in the operation, which is what we do. But we don't build capacity unless we target it to learn the business, to get those head office skills in town. And the only way we get to do that is if we have equity in the game, if there's some skin in the game, if we invest. When we invest, we get more than salaries and wages, we get profits. If you put that back into the local economy, then we build our capital markets. So then we have the capacity to invest using the business skills and the capital in other sectors. That's what allows us then to be able to transform our economies rather than just participate in the sector. That only happens if you have the right scale and duration of activities to cause that to happen. It means, therefore, somebody needs to analyze really well what's happening, how long will it happen, how often things are needed. So understanding that moving up this pyramid gives you more capacity to more benefit, then encourages you to put in place the systems and policies to get there. Next one, please, Terrence. So this is, again, sorry, this is really an animation that doesn't work at all like this. But essentially, there's stages in getting to local content. Now, people tend to think about getting a policy in place and we're all good to go. But local content only really happens when somebody is hired and trained and a contract is given to somebody. That does not happen unless they're able to do that job. So there must be some capacity built to get people ready for that job. Now, when companies come into country, we've already built capacity in some goods and services areas. We've trained people in primary school, secondary school, university. We don't tend to value that as much as we should, but we have invested in that. What is required is building more so that people can participate. Now, local content policies and laws and guidance from people like the World Bank tell you should certainly give locals the advantage, provided they meet existing conditions of capability, cost, and deliverability. Well, guess what? That is a false premise. Because unless you have experience, you can never be competitive. So if you're not competitive, how do you get to be competitive? The only way is to participate. So there must be an intervention that says local content is necessary but not sufficient. As you do your activities, you should also be building capacity. You should find a way to give locals to participate, to get experience, to grow. Again, so it's not just local content, it's capacity development, and they must go hand in hand. It's not just about training in a classroom, it's about on-the-job experience. And that's where partnership, guide, knowledge transfer, experience transfer comes in. So to get all this done, somebody has to do analysis, deep analysis of what is the demand profile like, what goods and services, how long, in what quantities, what is the continuity. That takes a lot of insights and knowledge of the industry. Information is there. Governments don't always have access to it because quite often governments don't know what to ask for. Now, having said that, there's a lot we can go for, a lot of possibilities, but we're pragmatic and we know that we can't go after everything. But there's some things that we want more than others. So we want to get those. And then we have to analyze, is what we want viable and is it sustainable? So therefore, we use that to build a strategy to move into that space, what to do, how to get there. And then that is what we need to do to drive a policy that gives the principles by which different players will act to get things done where we want to get it done. Only then will people be ready and able to do the work. But a policy does not implement itself. Policy has to be implemented. Has to be implemented in a transparent way and a consistent way to be effective. And that's where legislation and policy and regulations come in. That's where an accountable, capable regulator comes in, who is empowered by that regulation, that legislation, and who is capable and has the right people and the right financing. So all of these is necessary. One mistake we tend to make in places like ours is that we build things, but we don't build in a process of monitoring, evaluation, and renewal. And over time, policies need to change. So I mentioned Trinidad and Tobago. We had local content laws in 69, strong regulations in 71. In the 90s, we found a lot of natural gas. And we recognized that the laws and regulations had big gaps in natural gas. So we built a policy in 2003, 2004 that captured the intent to close that gap. In other words, we said, with this law, this is how we want it implemented to get the benefit from natural gas. And that's one thing we need to make sure that we have that monitoring and review in place. Next one, please, Terence.
Yeah.
So put it up there to say, you can cut and slice what you go after in many ways. And I have different versions of this graphic. Some goods and services give you more jobs. Some give you, it's not on this side, higher value jobs than others. Some allow you to provide goods for local manufacture or production, and some allow locals to invest for the banks to finance and people to get profit. So you have to be very analytical and strategic about where you focus your priorities. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so we go for 2 more minutes.
I'm almost done. So essentially what I'm saying is that local content requires more than just people and skills. It requires supporting institutions like universities and so on. It requires infrastructure like ports and so on. And there are many, many stakeholders with many different roles, whether the operators, companies, government, business associations, banks, and so on. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. The bottom line is that local content, as you would have seen from what I described, is complex. It involves many moving parts. It involves many players who don't all have the same priorities. It crosses multiple regulators. We only spoke about the upstream oil and gas regulator, but the tax regulator is very important. The education regulator is important, standards regulator. So there are many regulators out there and other agencies who oversee these regulators, like Parliament, for instance. What role does Parliament play in ensuring the regulations are being followed? That's a big issue in many places. So therefore, for it to be successful, it needs to be managed in a very strategic way. There needs to be an overarching, and in my view, a single authority to which all this passes to coordinate this thing. But the stakeholders need to be involved, and I put the business community up here. All stakeholders need to be informed of what the opportunities are, what the demand is, what the cycle is like, what the risks are. They need to be educated. They need to be aware of where the gaps are, and they need to be assured that they make investments. There's some kind of control mechanism to ensure that the investments can get the benefits. And there must always be continuous engagement among stakeholders. And that, to me, Terence, is in my quick snapshot of what local content is and how it gets labeled. It's a lot to put in a few minutes, and I went fast, I know, but thank you for giving me the opportunity.
No, it was quite comprehensive, and it really gave us the kind of perspective that I think is much needed for the conversation around Guyana. And it gave a very nice segue into what I want to ask Joel to do, which is to tell us a bit about where we are today with the local content legislation in Guyana, and in a sense, what Tony is giving is a roadmap for where this thing ought to be going. How are we doing along these, as he puts them, horizons of capacity development in our context? So, Joel.
Thank you, Dr. Blackman, and good morning to my fellow panelists, esteemed panelists. It's always a pleasure and privilege to be here among these distinguished professionals in their field. So I think you give me the easiest task, Terence, to tell you, basically to report on what we have accomplished so far. And as you rightly pointed out, Anthony has set the overarching framework and context. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Anthony had a hand in the architect of our local content legislation as well. I think you were sitting on that panel. So from the legislation standpoint, it's just under 2 years old since implementation, since it was enacted. And so we have the benefit of 1 year of data to analyze. That process began during the period of December to January last year, coming into this year. I was involved in those exercises in terms of the consultation period. So the regulator is in the process of still receiving feedback from stakeholders within the sector to measure how well the legislation has done in terms of achieving its objective. So, and what have we achieved? So first, let me start, before I go to the numbers, let me start with the local content secretariat, which was set up to basically enforce the legislation, monitor and regulate. This data I have obtained from the secretariat. So up to this point, we have about 838 companies that are registered with the local content secretariat, meaning these are 838 companies that has local content certificates. Of that 838, we have 752 companies, or that's about 90% of the total, that are 100% Guyanese owned. And the reason why I make this distinction is because in accordance with our local content legislation, and Anthony was speaking of the definition, you have 100% Guyanese owned companies, and then you have companies that has to meet the criteria to pass to be considered a local company, where you have partnership with foreign companies. That formula is 51% Guyanese ownership and 49% minimum, and 49% foreign ownership. And then you have the other criteria, 90% local staff, a certain threshold of their management, and so on, to be considered. So that's why I make that distinction, to understand we have 100%, we have 90% of the total companies that are 100% Guyanese owned, and just about 10% that are in that joint venture formula with 51-49. Conservatively, this is a conservative estimate from the secretariat, about 80 to 90% of these companies have active contracts in the oil and gas sector. And this would be from the contractor, directly with the contractor. Then you have the subcontractors. Most of the contracts are disseminated through the subcontractors based on the operator's business model. They outsource almost everything. In terms of monetary value, as Anthony alluded to. So it's important to give some context to understand what was the spend like before we enacted the legislation, from the point when we uh, announced discovery in 2015. The local content spend was less than 1%, um, very small. And now, as of 2022, the local content spend is about 700 million US dollars. There was some confusion in the media about this $700 million number. And the confusion came about when Exxon, EEPGL, their subsidiary, announced that their local content spend was 400 million. So there was some confusion. Why is there a disparity? But the disparity is, or the variance is, the local content secretariat measures local content spend in accordance with the Local Content Act. So Exxon, EEPGL, their subsidiary, as a contractor, they only report on their spend in terms of procurement of goods and services, but they also have to report to the secretariat their spend on employment, local employment, and training and capacity building. And that is only EEPGL. You also have other contractors, that such as CGX and so on. They have to also report. So that is the explanation for the variance between what Exxon reported and what this secretariat reported. We are projected to increase that number to a billion this year, and that number will continue to grow as companies continue to make investments in capacity building, and local companies continue to build partnership and make investment in building their own capability and capacity and so on. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the value of local content. To put that into further perspective, we are now producing the earnings from the state in terms of the revenues that come to the state in profit oil and royalty for this year is projected at $1 billion. Before we started to produce from, right now we're producing from 2 FPSOs. Before that, our annual revenue was $300 million profit and royalty. And then that ramped up to 600 million. And now we're at $1 billion, and local content spend is projected to. So it's almost parallel. The local content spend is almost going to become parallel or equal to the rent, the revenue that will come directly to the Natural Resources Fund. Of course, there are some challenges, but you asked me to report.
No. Well, I mean, you could say a few words about the challenges. I wanted. So my thinking was, I wanted to highlight some of the successful examples of local content, and obviously the challenges. We've seen some of the challenges. We've seen the things with ramps, logistics, and so on. But just to give a proper objective report. There are challenges and there are opportunities, and so we should always have both of them sitting on the table, so that we don't get overwhelmed in one direction or another. So anything else you want to add, we're certainly happy to hear.
Yeah, certainly there are some challenges. There are complaints coming from the private sector players who are saying that they have the capacity, but they're still not getting enough that they could take on. And so there are some ways in which the policymakers would look to, based on these feedback and so on from stakeholders, to strengthen the local content to maximize that spend. Because while the legislation has yielded, I would say, successful result for the country and the private sector and the Guyanese people by extension, you don't know how much we are losing. right? You don't know how much you're losing unless you do a proper analysis, right? When you speak to Exxon, when you speak to the operator, they their metric is they're concerned about complying with the legislation. So they are not particularly focused on we have SMEs, we have small businesses, and we have our Procurement Act, the National Procurement Act has a special provision for SMEs. They're not looking at it in that way. They're looking at it, well, we have 800 companies registered with local content certificates. And as long as we tick the boxes and you have this certificate, we're in compliance. So they won't go the extra mile unless, it is legislated and unless the complaints by the private sector players could be backed up, of course, with data, has an empirical basis, not just complaint for complaint's sake. So there are some issues there in terms that could be strengthened, and we'd expect that to, the intention is to run with the first legislation as is. We measure our performance, we see how that done, the results we obtain from that. We can expect amendments to the legislation, and then you have the targets. And an important point I want to point out, the legislation was done in such a way that the targets, like from the contractor's perspective, the oil company's perspective, they were concerned about the targets, whether it's achievable, it's practical, and so on. So the targets is flexible. It's not there in stone. It could go up and it could come down based on data, of course. The idea is for these decisions to be data driven, and so a lot of analysis. And if targets need to be adjusted, say for example, we don't have the capacity in a certain area, you don't have to go to Parliament to amend the legislation.
Yeah.
It is designed in such a way that the target is a schedule to Schedule 1, for example, to the legislation. So the minister could make that adjustment and have it gazetted rather than going
back to Parliament.
The Parliament. So, in the interest, because the goal is there are so many things to balance. They don't want to stop, operations in the sector or to distort any operation. So smooth flow all the time.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we can see some green leaves, some shoots there that, as you say, you have 90% of the companies that are 100% Guyanese owned. You have 80 to 90% of the companies registered with the Secretariat that have, active contracts. The monetary value is north of $700 million US dollars. So I think broadly speaking, that this seems to be working in a manner that Tony Paul has described. But there still are some issues which have arisen, and I took note at the time of the enactment of the local contents legislation of writings by Andrew Brandley in the newspaper around some of the challenges that a potential legislation could face in relation to really seeing that trickle not just go to the companies but more broadly shared across Guyana. And so I wanted to kind of invite you, Andre, to kind of give us a thought. Let me pop the slides up, and I'll click them for you.
Hold a second with the slides. I'll give you a little introduction to the audience.
Okay, very well.
And then I'll tell you when to pull it up.
And then you'll tell me when to
pull up the slides. Yeah.
Yes. So go ahead. The floor is yours, Andre.
Yes, thank you very much. And I would also like to thank the two previous speakers that have set really a great stage for me to come in with my essentially criticism of the current local content act in Guyana, which, as Terence has mentioned, is based on a letter that I wrote last year, and that was published in Starbrook News and in Kaiju News. It led to a number of pushback from government economists, etc. And I would just maybe give you a perspective from where I'm coming. What you see in the background is Zurich, Switzerland, Lake of Zurich. I'm of Swiss and Guyanese heritage. My mother is Guyanese. I grew up here. I've been back to Guyana regularly over the last 60 years. I know the country probably extremely well, many more probably than a lot of the Guyanese in the diaspora, definitely for those in Switzerland, those in Europe. Switzerland is a unique economy because it started out as a dirt poor country in the 19th century. How did it become one of the most prosperous countries in the world without natural resources? It did this by a number of measures. It is a stable democracy. It has rule of law. It has simple regulations. It doesn't have a local content law. It invites companies to come here to work and prosper. It has low taxation. It has an efficient bureaucracy, and it has transparent processes. This is just in a nutshell what Switzerland offers.
I have to say, I spent 2 summers in Weggis, so I
okay, good. So you've seen it.
It offers
an excellent infrastructure. People are reliable,
yes.
But we don't need local content here because people come here because we have no local content, but they can get work done. That's what counts. If you are investing money, you want to get work done. You want to be able to draw on a skilled labor force, what the Swiss government offers by having probably one of the best educational systems. Yeah. Best schools are public schools. Private schools are only just kids are sent by rich parents for kids that can't make it in the public school system. Good, so this is sort of the starting point. Now, Guyana is a country that didn't have resources that they were able to monetize for the longest time. We don't have to dwell on this. I think with the onset of the oil era, we're in a different situation, and we should be able to use that money for the benefit of the Guyanese people. My hypothesis is that this local content law does the opposite than what we are told. And I think Tony already pointed out, you have to distinguish what do you want to do with local content legislation? Do you want to close off and be protective? Or do you want to provide a playing ground where foreign companies come in, they enjoy being here, and as a sort of fringe benefit, they train local people? Because a foreign company, the most easiest thing is to draw from the local labor force. Bringing in people from abroad is a big cost factor because you have to pay them bigger salaries, they have expat a situation, etc., etc. On the other hand, countries like Switzerland, the watch industry was brought in by French Huguenots and Jewish people that had to leave France because they were discriminated. They were able to operate in Switzerland without any local content legislation. They just had to adhere to pay their taxes. They recruited local people, etc. So that is not the point. Huh? So let me put the slides here, and I will just point out where I see the problems. So these are the key provisions of the Local Content Act. So you define a Guyanese company. It has to be incorporated in Guyana. That makes sense. But then you have 51% of the ownership has to be by Guyanese nationals. Huh? We don't have these rules in Switzerland. You have to be registered as a company in Switzerland, of course. You have to pay your taxes here, but no rules here who has to own the company. Next point, a Guyanese company must have 75% of executive and senior management positions. Tall number, huh? 90% of the workforce has to be non-managerial and other positions. This has to be Guyanese nationals. Huh? I've got a colleague that runs a meat curing business in Georgetown. He's so excited about his Venezuelan employees that work so well. I told him, I won't mention his name, you won't, with your Venezuelan employees, although they're good workers, you don't qualify being a Guyanese company because you're going to fall below this threshold. Top of it, you have here, as Joel mentioned, you have to be registered by the local content secretariat, Accreditation has to be checked annually. I guess you also have to write reports. A lot of bureaucratic burden. Move to the next slide, please. So some facts about the labor market here in Guyana. Guyana is a small economy, 800,000 people. That's half the size of the Canton Zurich in Switzerland. We have 35% of the population is below 18, so they don't even contribute to the labor force yet. 68% of the workforce is in the private sector, but this means the rest is in the public sector. You can't draw from those other ones. We have a relatively high public sector in Guyana. There's a shortage of skilled labor. There's a small pool of Guyanese with tertiary degrees. A lot of them are in the diaspora with these tertiary degrees. Terence is an example. I'm an example. There are a lot of other people. Then the oil and gas industry competes successfully for those few employees that have the skills, which leads to other problems. I can recall that the General Revenue Agency, has problems in finding auditors because as soon as they train auditors, they end up going to the oil and gas industry that pays better. So do we have a Dutch disease in the making? Next slide, please. I'm going relatively fast. So what are the negative consequences? You mentioned the issue with RAMS logistics. So companies are blocked from being entered into the local registry. I don't know how widespread it is. I didn't hear about a lot of other cases. There's accusations now in the press about rent as citizen practices because companies are trying to circumvent these provisions to become a Guyanese company. They need, of course, to fulfill all those really stringent requirements. There are accusations now, this was last year, that Guyanese abroad are fronting, standing up there as citizens to fill the requirements as being serving as shareholders, but they're just sort of straw men. There's an increased bureaucratic burden levied on the companies because you have to go through this local content secretariat. If you restrict your market from foreign competition, what is the result? And we see this in all economic markets. You get inflated prices for services and goods because there's less competition. And the other thing, and I think Tony pointed out really beautifully in his presentation, you get a reduced access to foreign know-how and technology because you don't hire the best in the area, you hire those that fulfill these criteria you've seen in 2 slides before. Next slide, please. So what do you really want to achieve? And I think Tony also was putting out here. You want to protect Guyanese workers, for example. So in my opinion, they should get, of course, priority to filling any new jobs offered in the industry. I would also advise, as we do in Switzerland, all new job openings have to be listed on the government website so the population knows what's available. If these jobs cannot be filled, then they should be going after a certain period that the company can hire people from abroad. And you also have to, of course, then to facilitate the process of getting work permits, that you are efficient. It can't take then for ages to get then work permits for these people. This also has consequences because it means that we have immigration into the country, not out of the country. I think if you look at Dubai, you have 2/3 or maybe even 80% of the population are non-locals. This will have a major impact in the way the country is being run and who has civil rights, who's not, who can participate, etc. Then I think in terms of protecting Guyanese workers, you have to have requirements that companies operating in Guyana have to train the people. Example, Swiss apprenticeship system. We won't have time to talk about this, but this is an excellent system that basically is a private-public partnership where people are trained in companies and the state offers the theoretical training, but people are based in companies, young people, particularly those 35%. Introduction of a national employment insurance, which protects people from losing jobs if companies go out of business for a limited time. I have not seen no proposals for that by the current government. And promotion of local entrepreneurship. Next slide, please. So how can you do this? For example, a lot of startup companies suffer that they can't get capital to get started. The government could probably provide low interest loans. You can remove bureaucratic hurdles. You can incorporate companies fast. Startup-friendly taxation, tax only startup companies once they generate profits, not before. I would suggest introducing a 15% corporate tax all over Guyana for all companies, including all the oil companies. This is a OECD recommendation. Guyana has not signed that OECD recommendation. The 15% corporate tax is to big multinationals. All CARICOM states have signed except for Guyana. I wrote a letter a few months ago. Nothing has heard. Nobody talks about this. Bring down the corporate tax rate to 15% would, of course, also make it for small businesses easier to operate because they will have a lower tax burden. And if the bigger companies pay more, you can basically compensate for the loss of tax revenue. Then we have creation of technology parks, low rent incubators that give startup companies sort of their operation cost low. And in the article, as I mentioned, setting up or in developing the Georgetown Stock Exchange as a global Caribbean stock exchange, which means that you can have their capital that can be invested in incorporated companies. You can start to develop a VC culture, etc. And I think Guyana could be there in the forefront if you have innovative people. What I do not want to see is that the government is financing, creating, and running local companies, because it's very simple, as I mentioned in the article, is bureaucrats are bad entrepreneurs. They don't have skin in the game. They're not investing their own money. They're investing public money. And this is a cardinal rule in Switzerland. The government doesn't run companies, with a few exceptions that are basically general utility companies that provide services to all citizens and have therefore are under government control. Next slide. That might be the last slide.
This was your last slide.
Okay, good. So that's it. So I just want to put this out here. It's a very different strategy to wealth creation. And I think what I've seen in Switzerland, I'm convinced can be done in Guyana. People are intelligent and smart, but it means that as a government, you follow the rule of law. You have a parliamentary system where everybody has a stake and a say, where you follow the procedures. And once again, I would just emphasize rule of law and efficient judiciary is the core, because that's investors want to see that their investments are protected and that they are not subject to a judiciary system that doesn't provide them the security that they need. And I can't see that the government has been making any moves in this direction. In one word, the local content law is here to protect a small class of Guyanese business owners from foreign competition, and the public is basically brainwashed that they profit from it. And this is maybe very harshly said, but I think it also reflects what I've just heard during my last visit in February in Guyana from a lot of people on the ground.
Yeah, I think, I mean, part of the reason for the invitation, I think it's important for us to have at times a kind of sharp critique of what we're doing as a way to kind of helping us form a consensus that moves the country forward in an equitable manner. And I you know, I visited Switzerland. You know, I spent some time at the EPFL in Lausanne. So I understand very well the sort of efficiency, the focus on competence, and the idea that somehow you want to make your society competitive. But I also think that, you know, it's the gap between the EPFL and the University of Guyana says, you know, I need to protect the University of Guyana. I can't just allow it to be completely overwhelmed by the EPFL in Lausanne, because if I just open the door, this would happen. So there's some balance that we need to find here, and
I strongly disagree.
No, I understand. I understand.
No, I'm just telling you, the faculty of Swiss University is 2/3 foreign.
Yeah, I understand you disagree.
Okay. But let's move on with Thomas.
Yes, so Thomas, I want you to give us this perspective from Mozambique that kind of says, well, how is Mozambique balancing some? What lessons, in a sense, Guyana can learn in this regard? So the floor is yours, Thomas. And again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Terence, and thank you everyone. So I will speak of Mozambique, but if you allow me, I will speak on all the different experience I had, so including Republic of Congo, Tanzania, Uganda, and I will just say from a global perspective, because workforce development and training always has a lot of thrill behind it and a lot of expectations. I will also like to highlight some things to be aware of, and it's the typical messages that have always been enforced, at least in all the countries I've had the opportunity to work in. So thank you to Andre, who highlighted a couple of numbers for Guyana. I don't have your experience in Guyana, but it was very interesting to note. And actually, when we talk about the importance of training, I think the first thing that's important to remind, and I think everyone has been highlighted it, but I'll just reinforce it, is that it's not because you have a master in business management that you are a competent CEO. And so the main things that these projects will be bringing is an opportunity to develop skills, so on-the-job training. And more broadly, I'd like to just remind that when we talk about an autonomous worker, so when I use the term autonomous worker, it means someone who you can let go and work freely without any supervision. He's a confirmed worker. He's someone who needs to gather three things. The first one is the knowledge. He gets a diploma out of school, but it's not sufficient. The second one is skills. And I will just give you some numbers on what it takes for someone to be autonomous. If I take a welder, for instance, it's in average 9 to 13 years of on-the-job training before this person is deemed accepted as a senior confirmed welder and autonomous on the job. And last but not least is the behavior. So behavior is something you can acquire between 3 and 6 months. It's just the habit of working in a big or heavy industry environment. So once this person has this treating, he's someone who then is eligible most of the time to go through a succession plan, especially for those supervisory or management positions. So I just want to emphasize this because if you compare these numbers to the lifespan of a project, construction is in average 5 years. You still have 8 years to go before you get those autonomous workers. So my point here is just to be reminded that whatever projects we are referring to, oil and gas, mining, and so on, it's only a leverage for development, but not a finality. So it's not enough, although there are some opportunities to be seized. So on this, on the job is the most beneficial learning opportunities. And then something I think is also very important to, again, re-emphasize it. It's the long-term vision. So we talk about skill development. When we come to very specific, highly technical job positions, so for instance, the operators or the maintenance people who will be working on the maintenance, they are job carriers that are very well known by the concessionaires and the contractors. They're very special, extremely specialized people. And in general, the training that's related to it is anticipated. So at early stage in the project, and I've never seen any issues in training these people just because now it's a custom training. So the training plan that comes with it is quite custom, is always fit to the need of the concessionaire. That being said, when it comes to the other position, most of them are not oil and gas specific. Yes, there's some need for engineers. Yes, there's some need for project management. Yes, they will need to get those skills and those this behavior that is specific to the industry standards. But no, they are not oil and gas specific. And I think it's very important to emphasize this. So when there are training plans, it's to serve a longer purpose and term objective. And I think here, often what I see in a lot of countries, we focus a lot on the project, but we tend to forget the long-term vision of the country in which we are operating in. And sometimes it's not necessarily clear. We talk about a vision for a diversified economy. This is all very good, but if I don't have, as a capacity builder, the long-term vision, domain plan of the host country, it's very difficult for me to make an argumentation and say, we're going to invest in these training facilities and so on. And I believe it's the same for all those who work in this ecosystem. So that also includes development financial institutions, the private sector, and so on. So that's something I just want to enhance. When it comes to initiative, because there are a lot of initiative and partnership that are being built to support this workforce, I see it in two ways. The first one, and I always see it from a project side. So I've been a local content director manager for a long time. So this is my background and experience. Like Tony, I'm a practitioner. But I see it from the private sector side. I have a need, I will need to address it. So I will implement different type of tools and mechanisms to make the most out of it. So everything becomes operational, more reactive, so it fits a large supply chain demand, and most importantly, the very strict planning that is a project. If we look at this mechanism, and I'll just state a couple, we have database. So like everyone, if I want to employ a national, I need to know that this person exists. I need to know where he's localized. I need to know his credentials, etc., etc. This is not just a need I have as a potential concessionaires or contractors. This is a need that every company on the market has. But every company are going to, for the most, I want to say, readdress these same challenges on their own and on their side. So when you look at it, for me, the best initiatives are when these challenges are addressed in a collaborative manner. If tomorrow I need to source local national workers, I know I'm not the only one, so why don't I make a workforce database that fits the need of my fellow entrepreneurs and of the state and the Ministry of Education and so on and so on. So I think I see more and more initiative of this kind coming into the market, but they've been very, very discreet. And if I'm mentioning this, it's because often I see a lot of duplication of this initiative. So I've not necessarily seen it, especially when it comes to vocational training, etc. Although I do have some examples, but I won't give them. But I see them a lot when it comes to training SMEs, for instance. And I've seen amounts that are absolutely ridiculous, just overlap to address a same panel of companies in the same region and an exact same sector of activities. And we're talking 20, 30, 40 million of dollars of investments that are being duplicated. So that's one thing. I think communication is very important, and those who have the guts and the faith to share those terms of reference and invite others to contribute, which most of the time actually leads to more qualitative scope of work or programs, but also cheaper ones because everyone mutualizes the resources. So there's a lot of very knowledgeable and experts in any country, but not everyone has the same means to implement something. So if you have 100 people that have the same challenges when it comes to education and training, why don't they all come around the table or have a coordinator or have an entity, a business association coordinate this work and share this everyone expertise. So this is just an example. When it comes to qualitative programs, and this is something I like to think it's also very important, it's about the trainer aspect. Whatever worker will be employed, it will develop the skills. Whatever partnership there is with local training institutions, etc. Oil and gas is a very dynamic environment also when it comes to technology and skills. So we always need to be regularly updated, but we need to have ambassadors, teachers to relay this information to students and to existing workers. So a supervisor actually becomes a good teacher to his team, etc. And so I see more and more this type of initiative. It's either being conducted as personal initiative training or a small module to the supervisor, so to better operate this transfer of knowledge, but most importantly, to retain this capacity to share knowledge within the host country and within the national workforce. So those are some examples of initiative.
Yeah, yeah, Thomas, thank you. So colleagues, we're running just a little behind schedule, but I'm going to beg your indulgence. This has been quite an interesting conversation. I'm going to beg if you can just hold for a little, maybe just maybe 10 minutes longer than I asked you for. I wanted to bring in Professor Anthony Bryan at this moment to just kind of to bring some kind of cohesion to all that has been said. It's a very important kind of divide as a yes, local content, no local content, if local content, how do we do it effectively? And I want you as the sort of wise person here to, give us a frame that we can all work with. You're muted. You're muted. You're muted.
Okay, Terence. I missed a part of the presentation. As you know, I was AWOL for a while with a very bad connection. Yes. I'm back now. But I got enough of the sense of it. And I think one message that comes through is that increased local content will remain elusive unless it is supported by positive action on the part of government and the firms that account for most of the sector expenditure. I think Tony Paul gave a series of definitions of local content, very precise, and we've gone over those before. I'm moved by Andre's suggestion that companies should not, be responsible for this, or that governments, in fact, should not have anything to do with it. That, of course, is a lovely subject for debate. But I think overall, what local content I gather from this does is it maximizes the level of usage of local goods, of services, of people, business, financing. So all in all, it really can't be a bad thing. I think I get from it that specific targets should be set for establishing a ratio of nationals to non-nationals in energy sector employment. To some degree, to look at that percentage of in-country expenditure for all operators and for third-party expenditures. Of course, we talk about targeting of specific skill set for nationals. So this debate, of course, together with Tony Paul, I've been a part of it for a long, long time. There are very divergent views, a lot of them expressed here today. But all in all, I think this was really a very fascinating exploration of a subject called local content. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it's generated quite a bit of, so I want to indulge you with the following remarks. So 2 remarks emerge. One from Donald Taylor Bruce, which I guess is a bit in support. His argument is that the Cayman Islands in the Caribbean has done better than a vast majority of the region by, in a sense, patterning Switzerland. Andre's argument. However, the question is, can we all do this? And the question that dovetailed with this was, local content will depend, as has been said, on a critical mass of Guyanese receiving adequate education through high school. So Guyana needs to ramp up their efforts in this to create this sort of pipeline. And maybe, I can start there and ask you to comment in order. Thomas, Tony, Andre, and Joel, in a sense, based on your experiences, what are your recommendations for Guyanese to achieve this critical mass in a fairly short order?
So since you called me first, I'll start first. Let me just start by saying that I agree with a lot of what's been said by Andrea and Thomas, and I acknowledge what Joel has said and what's happening. But I also want to say that there are a lot of what is said that in the negative side, the downside. There are arguments to counter those which have come across in the past. So it's not a closed point of view in any case, So, and I've because I've worked on the other side, the company side, I know how those can be overcome. Yeah, it's very pragmatic. Companies are very, very, very good in oil and gas at solving problems. That's what they do, and they're also very good at managing risks and getting the two together. What happened? And all the suggestions you made, Andrea, are good suggestions. But there are many ways to get what Guyana wants out of where they are going forward. So let me just put that on the table. Now, in terms of the ramping up the workforce, it comes down to how you define local content. And actually, the way Guyana is going forward with this definition is, in a sense, flawed. Because if you think of a local company being one of the 51% Guyanese and 49% foreign, and you call that 100% local content, it's flawed. It's actually 51% local content if you measure it in terms of the value that stays in the country, right? So the 100% should not be the target. It should be a realistic target based on what actually you can provide, right? So I think the pragmatism needs to get to be grounded in the reality. But the question specifically about how to ramp up the workforce. Local content happens when work gets done in country, mostly, right? Now, that 80% of expenditure that goes to the companies, right? Andre says that companies coming to Switzerland, establish and do business, they don't have to be local. But you know what they do, Andre? They pay taxes in Switzerland. None of these 80% companies pay any taxes in Guyana. None. Right? But they're paying taxes somewhere else. And Guyana is paying them. So you bring them in country, you can bring all the foreigners you want. And I did that in Trinidad when I brought my exploration team into Trinidad as exploration manager, all foreigners. But very quickly things changed. Right? The other thing that, and I think Andre mentioned it, when you give the Dubai example of a country with a diverse population. Small populations in countries who have evolved well, like Dubai, like the other Emirates, like Singapore. What they had was an enlightened migration policy, right? And fundamental to all of that, of course, is the bureaucracy and the procedures for getting work permits and moving people and so on. So there's a lot, all these problems that I've heard, there are solutions that have been developed at other places. But it needs more conversation, it needs more openness. So if we're talking about a population that's too small, we should think about let's get it done in country first with whomever can do it. That is the incentive to develop people. And only then, as Thomas is saying, when people get the experience by actually participating, because then it's done in country. So all these problems we face have been solved in many places before.
Joel, these problems have been solved. How are we solving? How are we solving?
So thank you for bringing me in at this critical juncture, Terence. So first, let me state that I disagree with most of Andre's proposition and assertions. And I think a lot of it are some misconceptions about the local content. So let me use this opportunity to clarify those misconceptions. So the first thing we have to appreciate is that, and I can understand from an outsider's perspective why these misconceptions are easily formed. So the first thing we have to understand is that the local content legislation does not prohibit, it's not 100% or a fully protectionist mechanism. It does not prohibit foreign entry. So let's understand the broad context. The local content as it is carved out 40 sectors only. The goods and services that are required in the oil and gas entire value chain is over 200 plus. Some reports, you read some literature, it tells you over 500. So that's a very small percentage that we have carved out, which we have considered low-hanging fruits. Now, all those considerations were taken into account. The need to balance the act, because all those concerns that Andre presented are the very concerns when the Local Content Act was in the making that the oil companies presented. The oil companies never supported it. And they developed all the arguments that Andre put forward to not implement the local content. And we've proven them wrong but we did not ignore as a country, we did not ignore the merits of those concerns. And so the act is built with flexibility. I've seen, and I saw Andrea wrote about this, that the local content is rigid. It's not a rigid local content. There are several mechanisms in which that allows flexibility. So, for example, a foreign company could come in by way of a joint venture arrangement using the 51-49% mechanism. That's one. Two, a foreign company could come in and operate without prohibition if the foreign company is providing a goods and service that is not on that 40 in that schedule of 40, then nothing is preventing that company from operating and getting business in this sector. If in a third scenario, if a foreign company comes in and there is a target for local content of say 80%, there is still 20% room that they could participate in the procurement of a particular good or service. And even fourthly, even if there is a high target, like for example, there is one case right now where a particular sector is set at 100%. And so there is a particular regional company that is operating in that sector. And it does not mean that that regional company is completely locked out, because while it is set at 100%, that particular sector, the local companies do not have the capacity to provide 100% service. So there is another flexibility in the legislation where that company now write to the minister has the power to give the approval or the permission for that foreign company to participate, as long as the local market does not have the capacity. As long as local companies does not have the capacity, foreign companies are allowed by way of following the procedure. The other important point to note is that the local content legislation is specific to oil and gas. All the other sectors are open for foreign companies and foreign participation. So there is no prohibition, we're not locking out anything. And lastly, my last comment in response to Professor Brandley, I think, and I say this respectfully, it is an irresponsible thing to say that the local content spend is a sham to tell the population that it distracts, or it's to trivialize it in that manner that is not real. It is irresponsible because $700 million for a country like Guyana, it represents 5% of our overall real GDP. It represents 14% of our non-oil GDP. It represents 20% of our national budget. And it's almost close, say about 80-90% of the oil rents that come. So that is tangible. Then this sector also employs conservatively 10,000 people, Guyanese people. So how could you trivialize that? It is very irresponsible to say. So
we'll stay away from irresponsible, but I think with your larger point is taken that the 700 million is a significant monetary contribution within the context of the Guyanese economy. And so perhaps I'll give Andrea the opportunity to respond, but I think we will.
I won't go into the nitty-gritty. The 700 million are numbers that are put out by the government. They have not been validated or verified by the IMF or by the International Development Bank and so on. So these are basically, could also be seen as fantasy numbers. The other thing I have to say, essentially most of the expenditures of the oil and gas industry are actually paid by the Guyanese people through their own resources, because as we all know, 75% of the oil revenues go to capital recovery. So whatever Exxon invests, they're going to get back. So don't think about Exxon's investments in Guyana as a charity operation. Everything is covered. They have zero risks at this time. Just to add this on. As the Vice President actually has said, is the local content legislation was put in there because the current production sharing agreement is so loop-sided. I won't go into this whole discussion, but Vice President Jagdeo has mentioned this over and over. He doesn't want to renegotiate. He's using now this local content legislation to tell the Guyanese people, don't go for negotiations. You're going to get all your money back with this local content act. Joel is right that the legislation protects 40 sectors of the economy currently. There's big talk to expand this because one is afraid of additional competition. Let's get back to the key points that actually Terence asked me to comment on. Education. How can you improve education? You have to bring in people from abroad that bring the know-how to teach. This was done in Switzerland in the 19th century by bringing in educators from Germany, from England, from France. We paid them good salaries, provided them security. A lot of them were refugees because they were living under monarchies. There was no freedom of expression. Switzerland was the first republic in 1848 that offered this freedom, and a lot of them came to Switzerland. You pay them decent salaries that they can make a living. That makes the country attractive to be educators. Guyana has the means to do that. Migration that Tony Paul addressed. Migration can be taken care of already in CARICOM. I just heard that there should be freedom of movement. It's a mechanism that is implemented in the EU. Switzerland is participating and profits. So why aren't we not offering freedom of movement that any CARICOM citizen can work in Guyana if he finds a job? Trinidad has an oil and gas industry with a lot of nationals. I know a whole bunch of Guyanese that work there. That you could recruit back to Guyana if you provide them good salaries, security. We all know about the whole crime issue in Guyana. We need also rule of law. We need a government that follows the procedures. I just would like to mention that most of the parliamentary commissions are inactive or dormant or are boycotted, which also means that the whole parliamentary process doesn't lead to consensus building and to improved legislation. The Local Content Act was just put into Parliament on short notice. There was essentially one session with minimal debate. That's not the way you draft legislation. I invite Joel to come to Switzerland to see how we draft legislation by bringing in all stakeholders. Then taxation, last point, that was also pointed out by Tony. Taxation is how you recover and how you keep money in the country. The biggest contributor to Guyana's GDP is not paying taxes indefinitely. I think 15% taxes for Exxon and its partners would make a big difference. And it also, by the way, it also generate a lot of foreign currency for the Bank of Guyana, which they don't have right now, because if you have to pay taxes in Guyana, you have to take dollars, convert them into Guyanese dollars to pay the taxes. So I'll stop here.
No, I think you raised some very important points, and I think it is the sort of finding the kind of consensus that is necessary for maximizing Guyana's experience in this context requires a number of voices at the table, but it also requires, and I think I want to go to, so we're exactly at 9, so let's say 4 minutes. This is a conversation. I think I have to invite you guys back for local content part 2. You see, the thing is, there are a number of issues that go to, what an effective local content law. But I think I want to say that there are two things that I think we can't look past. I hear the arguments that you make, Andre, but I also think it's vitally important. We can't look past whether it is 400 million or 700 million, it is a significant amount of money in the context of Guyana. So we have to be balanced in that context. So Thomas, I wanted to give you 1 minute as a kind of amplifying remark, and then I wanted to finally go back to Anthony Bryan, and then we'll say thank you and close it. And if anyone has anything they want to jump in, you can just jump in real quickly. So Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Terence. No, for me, my closing remark is just to, and Tony emphasized it on local content. Really depends on the definition and the objective we want behind it, but it's easy to make local content. It's another thing to make it sustainable and to have the impact last. And to illustrate this purpose, it's even more easy to take a pretty picture of graduates of which you just finance the program. It's a harder thing to come 5 years later and see those same have a job. And this happens all of the time, most of the time, for communication issues. So this is just something I want to emphasize. I don't have all the solutions. I don't have, but I know these things needs to be anticipated, not when there's a down peak of activity, but as early as today and yesterday. So that would be my closing remark, to not wait for the succession plan. And again, there needs to be a long-term vision. Otherwise, good impacts, good reports cannot be taken away as easy as it came on the table.
Professor Bryan, it needs to be done today or yesterday?
Yeah, well, I don't know what needs to be done today or yesterday. What I do know is that probably you need another session for these gentlemen to discover the roadmap. There has to be a roadmap to unlocking Guyana's oil and gas wealth using local content development. I think this has been a fascinating discussion, and I wanted to thank, at least on behalf of the CPC and certainly of the GBH, for all your input. It was well worth the time and the effort. Thank you so much.
Yes, colleagues, thank you. I join Professor Anthony Bryan in thanking you. This has been a really excellent. Thank you, Tony Paul, for setting the groundwork and for giving us the real kind of sense of the lay of the land in the context of local content. I want to thank Joel for really kind of helping us to understand with some clarity the operations of the local content law over the last 2 years. Certainly, Andre, it's important for us to have, sharp criticism, robust debate if we are going to find a place. And Thomas, thank you for that example of, helping us to see it in a kind of technical sense. I like the, I often say what you just said, which is, folks often say, well, we want to get folks involved in things, and education is the way that you have to go. And I sort of try to explain that, if you start with someone at 10, they need 6 years before they get a high school diploma, and then they need another 4 years before. And so you've gone through a decade, and then they've just graduated, and now they have to go get some apprenticeship and training. And so then you're looking at about 13 to 15 years to see the output of the investment that you're making in this. And so you better be right when you set the strategic course off, because you're not going to be able to recover it if it doesn't work 15 years down the line. So the debate is important, and I want to thank you guys all very much. And I want to say that we have to have a local content too, and this will be coming up shortly. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much, and have a wonderful day, colleagues. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yes, very
Thank
good.
you.
That was excellent.